All right. So without further ado, thank you all for attending my session. My name is Andrew, and I am a developer relations engineer at Google. And today I'm going to talk a little about responsible AI, and more specifically as it relates to transparency artifacts and some of the recommended practices that have come out of the work that I and many others within and outside of Google have contributed to. And so, needless to say, I'm certain many of you see AI as foundational and transformational technology, but with recent advances, particularly in the generative AI space, this transformative potential requires us all to be responsible, not only in how it's being advanced, but also in how it's being envisioned and how the social impact of AI and machine learning enabled technologies are being assessed. So in my opinion, I think this endeavor necessitates both foundational and applied research with an interdisciplinary lens that engages with and accounts for the social, cultural, economic, and other contextual dimensions that shape the development and deployment of AI systems. And so with that, there's a lot of different approaches that have to account for the range of possible impacts that ongoing use of such technologies may have, particularly across vulnerable communities and broader social systems. And so with that, there's a lot of growing research work, as I'm sure you're all very aware of, that critically examines the societal impacts of AI. This work is often very complex and multifaceted, where no one disciplinary or methodological perspective can alone provide the necessary levels of diverse insights needed to grapple such social and cultural implications of AI and machine learning technologies. And so this diagram that you're seeing here represents some of the focus areas that I and a lot of the colleagues that I work with study in order to help establish more industry-wide recommended practices for responsible AI across the entire development process, from onset all the way to post-launch. But for the purposes of this session, I'm going to focus specifically on some of the work that I've been more involved with that support practitioners in meeting key responsible AI goals like transparency, fairness, and accountability. Now, when it comes to transparency, we've observed that there's this virtuous cycle in that things that are transparent are easier to understand, but at the same time, things that are easier to understand are perceived to be more transparent. But people involved across the data set or an AI model's life cycle often do not have a comparable or accurate understanding of the systems they are making decisions about. So these models are increasingly intertwined, making for the ability to parse the relationship between models and the data sets that are used to train these models a critical first step for ensuring that the outcomes of the decisions that are being made are fairer and more grounded in socio-technical terms. And so there's been a lot of attempts at introducing standardized, practical, sustainable mechanisms for transparency that create value at scale. Like some of the examples that you're seeing on this slide here, things like the dataset nutrition label, the data sheets for data sets project that came out of Microsoft with Tanit Gibru and Hannah Wallach. They were really at the forefront of all of that, and recently there's a version 2 of that. But there's also things like fact sheets, which is more for like service level AI transparency, and then things like system cards that's coming out of Meta, and like variations of model cards, which my former boss Meg Mitchell was very instrumental in establishing. But all of which to say is that there's a lot of different approaches to this, and a lot of that has to do with the reflection of all the real world constraints that's imposed when trying to achieve a diversity of goals, workflows, and backgrounds of not just the individual stakeholders that participate in the development of these data sets and AI systems, but the users that are impacted by their decisions. And so in the work that I'm involved in, we found that participants across multiple workshops often describe transparency as subjective or audience specific or contextual, and noting that there is a limited sort of like a constraint on how details are often simplified and becoming very insufficient and very impractical for a lot of use cases. And so we also found that the need to systemically identify both the kind of information that decision makers can use in decisions and the processes and guidance needed to acquire that information is necessary, because in essence, transparency needs to be framed in terms of systems as well as in terms of its intended audiences and goals. And so it's not just like a mere documentation artifact that you're putting together. It's a documentation that serves a purpose, that has an end goal, much like when creating a product. And so moving forward, for the purpose of this session, the way that when I bring up the term transparency, it's framed as a clear, easily understandable, and plain language explanation of what something is, what it does, and why it does that. And we chose this definition to emphasize that it's that domain agnostic, and that it's inclusive to all the different types of transparency artifacts that are created. But ultimately, the goal here is to approach this as a systems problem that looks at different teams across products, organizations, and how these transparency artifacts change over time. And so for this talk, I'll capture some of these highlights, some of the takeaways that we were able to develop from interviewing many different people that have had challenges creating dataset documentations, and show you some examples that we feel best represent some of the tenets and beliefs that are more aligned with like what's considered responsible AI. So to clearly and thoroughly understand a dataset's origin, its development, its intent, its ethical consideration, and its evolution, in order for these data sets to be used responsibly, we established a people-facing context in high-risk domains that has manifested into what we're calling data cards. And a data card is simply a boundary object that contains a structured collection of summaries, both observable as well as unobservable aspects. So you can think of things like, for example, a dataset attribute being an observable bit of information, but something that's like maybe not as observable are, for example, intended use cases, and where, no matter how much work you're doing into analyzing a data set, unless someone told you specifically what it's being used for, then there's no way of inferring its original intentions. And when it comes to the decision-making process, it's really important to know like what's the intent and purpose of how this data set needs to be used. So we wanted to create a means of allowing such artifacts to express both observable and unobservable aspects. So by design, as I mentioned earlier, data cards are brand and platform agnostic, and these aspects they carry along with many different types of transparency artifacts. And so, more broadly speaking, one of the aspects that we thought was really important to capture is that it needs to be extensible and modular. And to do this, we realized that a data card has to be organized in different sections so that users can easily navigate through it and find information. And this is especially important when this document is supposed to serve the needs of many different types of stakeholders, where some, like say a software engineer, might need a lot more technical details in order to implement some sort of pipeline to process this data set. But then maybe someone else, like those that are in legal, need to ascertain certain aspects of this data set or of the information in order to say, ensure that it's not policy violating and that it's abiding by regulation and things like that. So there's a lot of different UI approaches to this. The one that we settled with involves creating these sections, and in this section you have different tabs, and you're able to filter out by its category. But another thing that we wanted to focus on was to ensure that each section is presents the same type of information, but with like levels of granularity, so that again, someone that's more of an expert or more fluent in understanding the domain of the data set might benefit from being able to delve deeper, whereas others don't need to delve as deep, but they still need that information. And so each section, like you're seeing here on this slide, is decomposed into these different blocks. And that way, for example, each block has a title, like you're seeing here, but then there's prompting questions, and these questions can allow for what we refer to as producers, and I'll get to that in just a moment. Fill in the necessary details with respect to their intended users in mind. And then one last aspect that I wanted to cover here is the contextual aspect of this, and that for data cards to be intentionally structured, we use these different columns. And each of these columns represent different fidelity or detail of information. So starting with the far left, you have information that's just kind of like an overview of the data set. But then as you go to the middle column, things get a little more technical, a little more functional, operational. And then on the far right, you have sort of like the fine-grained details of that same type of question that's being asked. And so that way, again, depending on your reader, they'll be able to access different levels of information and still find this documentation useful, while others are able to easily navigate through it and not be too inundated with all that nuance. And so while there are many different data cards that exist today and used in practice, admittedly, it takes a lot of effort to put something like that together and to do so in an effective manner. So, so in other words, what I'm trying to say here is that there's no one-size solution that fits all, especially when it comes to AI transparency. There's just a lot of different cases, a lot of different needs, requirements. Different organizations have different ways of disseminating information. As I mentioned earlier, you have different stakeholders. So again, to the point I made earlier, it was crucial that we approach this in a more agnostic way, because there's just no way that we can encapsulate, a template or design that is accommodating for everyone's needs. And so what we did instead was we abstracted all the different frameworks and approaches that were that we saw were repeatable and consistent across many different types of transparency artifacts. And then we put them all together in this, in what we're calling the playbook. And again, the playbook is comprised of all these consistent and repeatable approaches, which sure you can use to create a data card, but it can also be used to create any type of transparency artifact, because as I mentioned, it's more about modularity, extensibility, being platform agnostic. But this comes from just running surveys and looking at how practitioners were struggling to create effective documentation, and how the challenges of communicating that information across different stakeholders. And let's see here. And so we took a more sort of a human-centric design approach to creating this playbook. And we ended up with these 4 different modules that you're seeing here, each of which is comprised of different articles and activities. But the takeaway here is that in order to create value in transparency, there needs to be a mechanism to engage with different stakeholders across the entire life cycle, and to depend on schemas that are more grounded in real world contexts, so that, for example, if you're trying to figure out what type of metrics to report, it's one thing to just sort of lean on what is like the recommended practice, but it's another thing to actually take a step back and figure out like what's the most effective way of communicating performance or expected performance of this data set. Should it be used in a machine learning or AI context? And then through there, let that sort of drive the way in which all the other information gets reported, including like how that metric was calculated, how to interpret that metric, what is the intention behind using such metric, why was that metric chosen? These are the kind of questions that is really hard to infer if you're just looking at the description of a data set, right? You need to put an effort in providing that context, or else those that are depending on the use of this data set will, their ability to engage in responsible decision making hinges on the amount of information and like the clarity and the usefulness of that information that's provided by those that produce the data set. So this playbook, it's comprised of 4 different modules. The first 2, 1 and 2, ask and inspect, are all about creating opportunities to ask questions, and then to sort of figure out which types of questions need to be featured in the data card, and that these questions are aligned with stakeholder interests. And then the latter half, 3 and 4, answer and audit, are more about like, okay, well, given these set of questions that we want to capture in this document, how do we go about answering them? How do we present that information? And is this data card even useful for our intended readers? So just to kind of quickly give you sort of like one of the highlights of each of these different modules, which again, this all stems from extensive research work that I and many others within the field, both at Google and outside, have contributed to. But something like what you're seeing on the screen here, the topology of stakeholders, we realized that it was really important that in order to capture all the different types of data sets, whether it's image-based, language, video, audio, tabular-based, it's important that there's a topology of cross-functional stakeholders that engage in that overall decision-making, because it's not like a data set is made by one person, right? It's usually comprised of a different stakeholders and team. So, we broke it down by producers, agents, and users, going from those that are creating the document and the data set to those that are highly dependent on these transparency reports and possess the agency to make action based on what's being reported. And then you have users that are being described in the very reports themselves, and our representatives that interact with the product, that rely on whatever is being built from these data sets. And then when it comes to figuring out which questions to even include in a data set, we realized early on that there needs to be a lot of thought and consideration in how to frame these questions with these stakeholders in mind. And so we use this guiding metaphor called scopes. And at the highest level, with scopes, you can capture some of the more obvious or straightforward questions that's very descriptive. But then it's important to also reframe these questions with different levels of depth, for the reasons I mentioned earlier, because you just never know what type of stakeholder, or if you do know what type of stakeholder or readers you have in mind, they more often than not, the way that people often get to develop an understanding of whether it's a data set or what have you is by asking a series of subsequent questions that are related to one another. And so we wanted to capture that in data cards and in transparency artifacts in general. And so this guiding metaphor here was beneficial in that. And here's an example of what I mean, where at the left, you have telescopic questions that are very easy to answer, but low on the utility side. But then, that's supported by periscopic questions that, provide a little more of an assessment, a little more details, things like just instances or snapshots of the data set itself. But then things get more in depth with microscopic questions, which are often more challenging to answer, because again, these are the sort of questions that, again, you can't just use some data science stack to answer them. You just have to know, or you have to either, if you are involved in the data set creation process, then these are details that you need to capture. Otherwise, there's just no way of inferring what was the intent behind the data set, or how was the data set annotated, things like that. And I know we're running a little short on time, so let's see here. I'm going to try to go through the rest of the content real quick, and then I will answer some. I see that there's some questions in the chat, so I'll get to that in just a moment. So hang tight. One other framework that we thought was really useful is what we're calling OFFEN, which is an acronym for Origins, Factuals, Transformations, Experience, and Examples. And this is just a way of both inductively and deductively assessing the quality and the fit of the different types of questions that you may want to ask in a data set. We found that a lot of different data set producers struggle to sort of frame questions, and so with this framework, they're able to not only understand how their question is categorized with respect to what aspect of the data set that it's speaking to, but it also provides them with a means of reevaluating this with different stakeholders in mind. And so given the same question, does it fulfill the needs of a software engineer versus does it fulfill the needs of a product designer versus does it fulfill the needs of policy and regulation? And so, by using such framework, data set producers were better able to articulate the information that is being presented. And then there's a lot more on how all this information is presented. And I talked about this a little bit, having these different columns, but just introducing a hierarchy made these artifacts a lot easier to digest. where, again, going from left to right, you have granularity of information that for some readers, it's a lot easier to just be able to sift through a document and get to the aspect that they really need to get to. And then from there, they're able to expand it like an accordion and delve deeper into some of these topics and see, whether this data set is a good fit for them, or if they do want to use it, what augmentations do they need to apply in order to ensure that the quality of its outcome meets their needs. And finally, once all of that is said and done, it's important to evaluate the effectiveness of your transparency artifact. And so we have 4 different heuristics, but there's many others, and I'll share the link later. But we felt that irrespective of whether it's a data card, model card, or what have you, data sheets for data sets, system cards, fact sheets, we found that transparency artifacts that are consistent, comprehensive, concise, and that embrace uncertainty are the most effective when it comes to ensuring that these documents are useful for their intended audiences. And so just to wrap this up, there's been a lot of work in this space in developing these frameworks, in developing different approaches to transparency, and this is all in the early stages. But I think collectively, there's now a good standard for being able to not only document data sets and AI models, but do so in a way that emphasize the ethical considerations of a data set that is a lot more practically acted upon, and that support production decisions and provide well-informed development of large AI models. So I know we are short at time here, but there's a lot of people that help contribute to all this throughout the years. So I don't have time to thank them all, but they're all there. And there's a URL if you want to see more of this work. And yeah, I think I have about 2 minutes left. So let me just go through the questions real quick. Yeah, so there was a question on the effectiveness of responsible AI tooling. As I showed in a slide earlier, let me see if I can go back. There was a slide on these heuristics. Yeah, here we go. That help to consider whether or not the documentation is crucial or not. But these heuristics can be applied to responsible AI tooling as well. Again, a lot of this was inspired by design workshops, and so in treating documentation as a product, a lot of this can go hand in hand, and so I think that helps there. There was a question on the toxicity score. That was in reference to a data card that was created by the Jigsaw team. They have a toxicity API. I think if you just do a search for that, you should be able to see more of their methodology behind how they calculate a toxicity. But one thing that I will say is that they looked at it from a disaggregated and intersectional perspective. So it wasn't just a mere toxicity score. It was also in relation to identity groups to ensure that the quality of the model performance is respective. It performs well irrespective of identity group assignment, so that it doesn't disproportionately perform poorly for one group versus another. But yeah, just search for Jigsaw toxicity API and you should be able to see in more detail. It's hard for me to summarize their approach in less than a minute, but you'll be able to find it there. And I think I am at time, so thank you all. If you have any further questions, please you can just drop me a message personally or in the Slack community or on LinkedIn. You can find me there. If you're interested in collaborating, I am open for that as well. So please reach out to me if you want to create transparency artifacts. Happy to help.